Thank you so much, and namaste to all of you. Thanks for inviting me. I wish you all a very happy new year. It's a very auspicious beginning, and let's hope that we forget all the inconveniences and the problems of last year and start afresh. So I'll be talking on the educational heritage of ancient India. For that, I'll be sharing my screen. So just bear with me for a few minutes. I think all of you are able to see my screen. So this is the book, the cover of the first book that I wrote, which is available on Amazon. And in that, I've talked about the ecosystem of learning that existed in ancient India, which made it the knowledge capital of the world. So I will go through my slides, and maybe I'll skip a few slides because I want to keep it at 30 minutes or 35, 40 minutes. So India was the educational capital of the world, which today you might find it a bit hard to believe, the situation that we are in today after colonization and many other things. But there was a time when students came from Western Asia, from China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Lanka, and what have you. All the countries that surrounded India, all the countries that valued education, they sent their top students to come and study in India. And these students made dangerous journeys. It was not easy to travel in those days where they could get into a train or a plane. So they had to walk, they had to take boats. There were many accidents along the way. Sometimes there would be robberies, but somehow the ones who really were keen to get their degrees from India would make those difficult journeys and reach the institution of their choice. So there were also difficult admission tests. It was not easy. If you just landed up in one of the great universities of India, you could not just straight away get admission. There were difficult tests. And in places like Nalanda, there were only 20% students who were selected, but coaching centers were available. So this focus on merit, it led to highly original work in art, logic, grammar, mathematics, engineering, sciences, especially medicine, chemistry, physics, metallurgy, navigation. If I were to tell you what all was taught in India, all the subjects, I would probably need 10, 15 minutes just for that. Almost every discipline that was important, the best teachers were available in India. So learning was a sacred duty. So as you know, in India, we all approached everything with a lot of shraddha, a lot of devotion. So education was one of the main duties of every person. And living in avidya, living in ignorance was considered a very bad thing. So, there were so many ceremonies, so many, all the milestones of learning were marked with ceremonies. So this is one picture of Vidyarambha, which used to be practiced all over India, and today I find it being more celebrated in South India, not so much in North India, but maybe it still is, and I have to find out about that. But you see, this is a ceremony called Vidyarambha or even Aksharabhyasa, in which the child learns to write the alphabets for the first time. So traditionally, they would use rice on a plate on which the child would be made to trace out Om or or some such alphabet, and this was performed for both girls and boys. There was another ceremony called Upanayana, which marked the entry into higher education, and then there was a ceremony called Samavartana, which marked the graduation. All these ceremonies were very meaningful. Guests used to be invited, and in the shlokas that were chanted, a lot of good advice was given to the students on how to lead their lives, how to respect elders, how to maintain brahmacharya, how to always try to seek the truth, and these kind of things. This was performed for both girls and boys in the Vedic period. It was like a second birth, because once you go through this ceremony in the presence of so many people, then a sense of responsibility would come on the students, because they would know that now we are not those little children doing whatever we like. We have to now focus on education. So it became, it used to be a solemn occasion. And so that's why Dvija. Dvija meant that a person is born again to a new person who is a student. Now, in ancient times, there used to be something like what we would call forest universities today, because if you read the Mahabharata and the text, you can make out that there were many gurukulas close to each other, and some of them were like managed by the main guru. Okay, so whether you take Naimisharanya, whether you take other gurukulas mentioned in Mahabharata, sometimes you can see that they're all being managed by one main guru, and then different subjects are being taught in the different gurukulas, just like different departments of a university. So you could say that these are the earliest universities of the world, and they were located in the forests, basically far away from crowded places. And in the midst of nature, the students would be taught different subjects. So they would always be surrounded by nature, never separate from it. Eventually, there were universities in almost every part of India, and different kinds of centers of learning, not just universities, but also some colleges. There would be mathas, there would be agraharas, different kinds of learning centers whereby education would be imparted in different ways suited to the people who lived over there. So you can see that there are so many universities in the eastern part of India. You have Nalanda, Udantapura, Nadia, Jagadala, Udantapura in Bihar and Bengal area. In fact, Bihar, the name itself came because there were so many viharas over there. Viharas were centers of education. And then if you go to the south, you see that there are so many there. By the way, this is in my new book, there'll be an updated map with many, many more centers covering almost the whole of the landmass. And in the south, you can see Kanchipuram, you can see Vijayapura, Salodgi, so many of them. Extreme south, you can see Kantalur Shala in Kerala, which was very, very well known. It was called the Nalanda of the south, and it had more subjects than Nalanda itself. And people would travel to these centers of learning from different regions. In the north, you can see Sharda Peeth, Purushapura. Sharda Peeth was in present-day Kashmir, and Kashmir of those times was very different. It was called Sharda Desh. It was a very important center of learning from where the best scholars used to come out. And Sharda Devi, Saraswati was the deity of that land. That's why the place itself was called Sharda Desh. Takshashila. Takshashila is the oldest university that we have excavated. There might be more, but so far this has been the oldest university. I'll show you some pictures of it. Many, many great people came out of these universities. Takshashila, Nalanda came out from there. Patanjali came out from, graduated from there. Then you can look at Ujjaini. Ujjaini in Madhya Pradesh was another very famous center of learning where mathematicians would get trained. Mostly the students who were very good in mathematics would try to get a seat in that university because they would be taught by the best mathematicians and astronomers. So here is a picture of Takshashila, which today is in Pakistan. This is, they say it is older than 6th century BC, but it was probably around 3000 BC. It is very, very old. Even Mahabharata was chanted for the first time over there. It was considered an honor to be speaking to the scholars of that place. Then we have, these are the ruins of Nalanda University, again a very famous university. It was beautiful. It had small little lakes all around in the campus. There was a tall wall all around the campus and a gate. And when you entered, then you would see the flowers blooming, the trees. This has been, of course, described by the students who studied there. The Chinese students who went to study in Nalanda have left behind glowing descriptions of the place. It was, of course, where they spent the best years of their lives. And they were the library there was very famous. It was a 9-storied building, and both Xuanzang and Yijing have talked about how the mist, early morning mist, used to envelop the campus, and you could see the higher stories above the mist. Then they have described the beautiful moonlit nights, the beautiful sunrises. So just imagine a campus like that in India, which was so famous that students came and considered themselves to be privileged to have studied over there. So we are still digging up more places, excavations are going on. So this is Telhara University, which was excavated in 2009. And this is even bigger than Nalanda. It is even older than Nalanda. So it was huge. So the story of India's educational heritage is still being told. It is not complete yet. The one thing that comes out is that the Indian society supported learning. The teacher was the most respected person in the society. So the entire society, it supported scholars financially, emotionally, personally. So during religious ceremonies, like what I showed earlier, almost all the religious ceremonies, donations were given to teachers and the educational institutions. So there was a great merit associated with doing a dana, giving dana to the institutions engaged in teaching, because then you are helping in vidya dana, which was considered very important. Now, education could be funded as an act of commemoration also. So it was, of course, a lot of, go to another slide which will explain how it was funded. But you could also give in the name of a departed relative. So suppose a father lost his son in a war, then he could institute a scholarship in the name of his son. And similarly, chairs could be set up in universities. Some of these things that we think are very modern things, but actually they have a very ancient past in India. So all this setting up of chairs, giving scholarships, these were very standard things in ancient India. The kings used to give land to the gurus who were doing good work. So they would, whenever a guru would become accomplished for being a very good teacher, very sincere and dedicated, then the kings would give them land so that they can build the centers of education, so that they can grow crops and feed themselves, feed the others also. There are many inscriptions which talk about this. So, in this manner, the seekers of knowledge were freed from the burden of earning a livelihood. That was the ecosystem. So, if you set yourself on a path of higher learning, then the society would support you. You didn't have to worry about where will I get my food from, how will I live, will I get, will I have enough clothes to wear. You didn't have to worry about that because society took care of the students and the teachers. So it was, you could almost call it an ideal society when it came to education. Just a minute. So the ethos of the times demanded that Brahmin scholars led very simple lives and engaged in pursuit of knowledge without amassing riches. So if you were called a Brahmana, it means there was a sense of responsibility that you could not make a lot of money. You had to teach without expecting money. Only maybe some expenses you could expect. There were gurukulas where kind of fees were being paid. That was mentioned in the Jatakas, but it was not for enriching the guru or anything, just a kind of token gifts, or bearing some expenses, that kind of thing. So it fell upon the shoulders of the wealthy non-Brahmin families and farmers to support those who devoted their entire lives to learning and teaching. So it was a very complementary kind of society where everybody knew that we are performing different roles. So there are those people who are engaged in learning, and we have to support them by ensuring that they are well fed and well clothed, and also during medical emergencies, they are taken care of. So the expenses were subsidized by the ruling kings. Nalanda was funded by the revenues of 100 villages. So it was one of the most well-funded universities of the times. The students and teachers received clothes, food, bedding, and medicines free of cost. And in some ashramas, the rich students paid, while the Brahmin students who were too poor to pay would opt to do the menial tasks. So they could also go and ask for bhiksha. They would ask for financial assistance from households. So that was the way it was. The different elements of society supporting each other, because they knew that that education should advance. There should not be a case where there's not enough money for students to study or teachers to teach. So that's why they were in fact competing with each other to ensure that that education was well funded. Now here is a picture of the great debate between Adi Shankara and Mandana Mishra. So I want to show you the culture of debating that existed in the times. And because, that's the reason we have so many schools of philosophy. Debating was an intrinsic part of our tradition. And that's why when somebody disagreed, they could form their own school of philosophy. And then they would have their own students who subscribe to their views. And again, if there were disagreements, then there would be debates, and if they decided to break up, then there would be another school of philosophy. So that's the way we have so many darshanas, so many viewpoints. And in this picture, notice that there's a woman who is the judge. which clearly shows to you that women were a part of the education system. So today, in today's talk, I'm not going to focus too much on women because that's a whole subject in itself. But please note that girls were educated and women were a part of the education system. There were women of high learning who were called Brahmavadinis, who were devoting their whole lives to learning. Now, so I'm on the topic of debate, and you should know that the terminology of debate was very well developed. It was like a science in itself, the topic of debating. There were terms like sadhya, which is the thesis to be established, siddhanta, which is the proposition, tenet, or conclusion, hetu, which means reason, udaharana, example, pratyaksha, perception, anumana, inference, pramana, proof. So there were many, many terms of the terms that were used during debating, and they were technical terms. They were very specific. So the debates went in a very structured way. They were not just random people talking to each other on any subject on earth. There would be a thesis that had to be established, and then there would be a proper debate. And onlookers would also learn a lot. Those who watched those debates learned a lot. There were, in fact, criteria by which points would be deducted for while debating. And debates could also be held during examinations. It could be a way of examination to see if a student has understood what has been taught. So, for example, Vasubandhu made these 22 criteria for deducting points during a debate. And I've only put 10 of them here, like hurting the proposition, shifting the proposition, opposing the proposition, renouncing the proposition, shifting the reason, shifting the meaning of the topic. So if you just go into the whole topic of debating, Nyaya, Tarka Shastra, you will realize that today we are actually living in a very in a degraded world, in the sense that today we don't debate that way. We are very random in the way we debate. If you see in TV, in television, the debates that are held, they are not really the kind of structured debates that we used to hold in ancient times. And the colleges, the institutes of learning, they themselves played a big role in nourishing the spirit of open debate and teaching how you should conduct debates. These were taught in colleges itself. The kings were fond of organizing intellectual tournaments, and those who were able to put forward finer points in philosophy, those who were ornate in diction, were rewarded. So in this way, the communication skills were constantly honed, and people spoke very well. They were able to, they were very articulate. It's not like today where we mix up languages and we sometimes don't communicate very clearly. In those days, scholars were not like that. Then I must mention that temples were also centers of learning. So temples were not just places where you went and worshipped your deity, but there would be debates, there would be discourses held in the annexes of the temples. And in this manner, even temples could be like universities. There were many temple universities. I wanted to show you a picture of the Sharda Peeth in Kashmir, which was a temple university, because there was the Sharda temple and there were all these scholars who were debating. There was a library which was famous, and scholars would go from different parts of India to refer to the most authoritative manuscripts over there. So this is a picture of an Agrahara, which was commonly found all over southern India. We still find them in ruins, but in northern India also maybe they existed. I don't know, I haven't found, maybe they are buried below the cities. But Agraharas were the colonies of teachers' houses. And in this, the students could go directly to the teacher's house and study there. So the kings used to give land to the gurus, and they would all live next to each other. So in a way, you could call these also like mini universities, because different disciplines were being taught, and they would be taught in the verandas of the houses, which you are seeing here. And sometimes debates would happen right there on the street, on which the people, because different professors and students would interact right there, and you could have debates there. So it was very interesting. All, centers which were so passionate about learning and reaching the truth and analyzing whatever knowledge was available. So here is an inscription if you travel in southern India and look for inscriptions which talk about education and learning, you'll find plenty in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, Telangana, Kerala. You find plenty. This is one of them, which is in Ennairam, which gives you the details of the college that has been established by the donors, and how much scholarship is being given to the students, how much allowance is being given to the teachers. All those things are mentioned in these inscriptions, which tell you that it was very institutionalized. So everything was very structured and went according to a certain pattern. Then there were mathas. Mathas, you might have heard of math or mathas, which we, matha basically. They were multi-purpose institutions. And in this, again, the students and the acharyas lived together. And they were not just educational institutions, they served as rest houses in which travelers like pilgrims and musicians could stay overnight or a number of days when they were traveling. So the mathas were also the place where they lived, where they stayed temporarily. And anyone who walked in was served food. Like today, what you see, what you call langar in gurdwaras, that was very common in the mathas of ancient India. And some of the mathas had hospitals to take care of the sick. So if any of the travelers was sick, then he or she would get medical treatment. There would be like a hospital attached to that. The inscriptions indicate that some mathas had vets who took care of sick animals. So sometimes people would be traveling with their animals like cows or horses, whatever animals, and even they would be treated if they were sick. And some of these mathas had libraries which preserved manuscripts. So when the classes are going on, students are learning, the travelers could also refer to those libraries. These mathas were funded by kings or by the communities or, the rich people. I'm sorry, was there an interruption in between? Can somebody answer?
No, ma'am, please continue.
Okay. So there was an interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. It was not like students stuck to just one subject, just one that they were taught, because there was no artificial divide between the subjects and also between religion, sciences, and other subjects. So the Brahmana priests used to be well versed in mathematics. It's not like they're religious, they're doing puja parts, so they don't know mathematics. They had to be well versed in mathematics. And the altars that were used in fire ceremonies, they had to be in accurate geometrical shapes. So they needed to be well versed in geometry. Yantras that were drawn at the time of the homa, the homa or the havan, for doing the yantras, they needed knowledge of geometry. Then the timing of the rituals had to be very accurate. So that needed a knowledge of astronomy, trigonometry. Now, if you know the story of Galileo, you will know that he was arrested after an inquisition by the Catholic Church because he said the earth went around the sun. And this was in the 17th century. But in India, there was never anything like that because the priests themselves were astronomers right from the Vedic period. And even subjects like math and poetry were not separated. We have Bhaskaracharya or Bhaskara II, who wrote famous works in mathematics, and he was a poet. So his works were written in poetry form, which are very acclaimed today. Beautiful verses, which are giving you the mathematical formulae. So imagine a kind of educational system where you have mathematician poets. Today, we are all very compartmentalized, but it was not like that in ancient India. So now I come to the period when knowledge was transferred from India to the rest of the world. First it started with China. Thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts were carried to China, and there were many scholars, Kashyapa Matanga, Dharmaratna, Sanghavarma, Dharmasatya. So many of these scholars who traveled from India to China in order to teach and set up China's educational ecosystem. Okay. The earliest that we know of are Kashyapa Matanga and Dharmaratna, who made very difficult journeys to China, but the Chinese were adamant in getting these people to China. They used any method to get the Indian scholars to move to China. Now, Kashmir supplied a steady stream of erudite scholars to China. Okay, obviously, since Kashmir was such a well-established center, many students, many scholars went from there. Dharmaruchi, who was a scholar from southern India, he lived in China for 20 years. So you can imagine it was not just people from the north, even people from the south were the teachers were going to teach in China. So we think globalization is a recent phenomenon, but it existed even 2003 years ago. And there was like a competition to get the best scholars from India. So there was a scholar called Dharmakshema from India who was shot by an assassin because two Chinese kings were competing for his services. And then one king said that got this scholar killed because he didn't want the other king to get him and have him in his court. So it was like that. There is a scholar called Amogha Vajra who was well known for collecting a huge number of texts, 500 texts from different parts of India. He collected and took them to China and translated many of them. 1 minute. So Indian astronomers and mathematicians from the best universities held high positions in China's scientific establishment. That's how they set up those departments in China. Astronomy, mathematics, different universities, they were set up by the professors who went from India. So there was an Indian scientist called Gautama Siddha, who was called Kutan Siddha in Chinese. He became the president of China's official board of astronomy in the 8th century. He translated the Navagraha calendar into Chinese. He introduced Indian numerals to China. So that's how Indian knowledge went to China. The Buddhist monks who went from India, they were trained in Ayurveda. And so, many departments of medicine were set up in China, thanks to these scholars who went from India, like ophthalmology. And these monks also performed cataract surgery on the local patients over there. And that's how they got great renown. That, Indian scholars were not just teaching, but they were healers. This is a statue of Kumara Jiva, who is a very famous Indian who went and taught, who lived in China. He was the teacher of Pahia, and it's because of him that Pahia came to study in India. So Kumara Jiva translated more than 100 Sanskrit works, which became masterpieces of Chinese literature. And even for him, there was a huge competition. There were two kings were competing to get him. Finally, he was even imprisoned for some time in order to ensure that the other king did not get him. So all these stories are very interesting. So I talked about China. Now this is about Greece. 1 minute. Pythagoras, it is said, traveled to India. This has been noted by many scholars such as Apuleius, Eusebius, Apollonius, Philostratus. So there are many scholars of that time who said that Pythagoras got his knowledge from India. For some reason, this has not been made popular knowledge in India, but this is something you need to know. So Pythagoras taught a lot of Vedanta in his teaching. There was a lot of Vedantic philosophy. Then Rishi Kanada, he seems to have influenced Democritus, who is considered the father of modern science. So Democritus has borrowed from Rishi Kanada, because a lot of this, you can see the same kind of concepts in that. And obviously Kanada was much more ancient than Democritus, and we know that students used to travel to India. So that's how we are able to make the connections. The Materia Medica, which was compiled by the Greek physician Dioscorides from 50 to 70 Common Era, contains a lot of herbs that were grown in India. Then there was the Library of Alexandria, which went to any extent to get the most original and most authoritative copies of manuscripts. So we know that a lot of Indian knowledge, a lot of Indian manuscripts were translated and kept in the Library of Alexandria. Sorry. So even the Arab world took freely from the knowledge of India, because the first acquaintance of Arabs with scientific astronomy and Hindu numerals was through the works of Brahmagupta, which was translated into Arabic by Al-Fazari. So Brahmagupta's work created a sensation in the Arab world, his Brahmasputa Siddhanta. And after that, many scholars began to be invited to Baghdad to live there. So just like what you saw in China, it happened in Baghdad. And there was a house of wisdom, which was like the Library of Alexandria, where the manuscripts used to be kept, and Indian manuscripts are also there. The Indian physician Manka-e-Hindi, he was in the court of the 5th Abbasid Khalifa, and he translated the Sushruta Samhita into Persian, because when they realized that the Sushruta Samhita has so much knowledge of curing illnesses, of preventing illnesses, so they got this physician to live in Baghdad and to translate the whole work. So the Muslim intellectuals of ancient times, such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Farghani, Al-Tabari, Al-Khwarizmi, They all were critical in transferring Indian knowledge of maths, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, and even music to the Islamic world. And they were, in fact, they were given lot of gratitude was expressed towards these towards the intellectuals who were transferring knowledge from India, and the ones who were going from India to live there. They were given a lot of respect. The subject of mathematics itself was called Hindisa. It meant it came from India or it came from Hindus. So maths itself was called a subject of the Indians or the Hindus. Now, from the Arab world, this knowledge went to Europe. Obviously, knowledge never stays confined to one region, and the European Renaissance was propelled by the works of Arabic scholars, which were passed off as original works by the Europeans. So it was ultimately they started acknowledging the Arabs, but then the Arabs themselves acknowledged that their knowledge came from India. So that's how we can see the whole chain by which knowledge went from India to the Europeans. There was a Toledo school of translators. You must know that there were major translation movements with the help of which Indian knowledge was translated into the foreign languages. And so in Toledo in Spain, there in the 12th and 13th century, there was a school devoted to translating the Arabic works to Latin. And most of these Arab works had come from India. They were translations of the Indian works. And even during the colonial period, when I mean, maybe that was one of the reasons when we say the Europeans found the route to India, it was not just to trade, not just to trade in spices and luxury goods and many other things. They also wanted India's knowledge, because usually, there would be scholars who would travel in those expeditions, and they would try to get hold of the manuscripts, and they would write papers and get it published in Europe. This was very common. So the contents of hundreds of Indian books made their way into books in Europe. It was as if a flood of Indic thought had been unleashed into Europe. Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British all collected large numbers of manuscripts. So there is a Bibliotheca Malabarica, which is a catalog of over 100 Tamil manuscripts that were collected by one single missionary named Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg from 1706 to 1708. So the more we learn about our history, we'll learn about how so many manuscripts were translated or taken away to Europe. This is the statue of Garcia Diorta, who is a very famous Portuguese medicine expert, doctor. He actually settled in Goa. And when he was living in Goa, he was fascinated by all the local knowledge of illnesses and the medicines for them. And so he collected all that information. He also grew many of those plants, the medicinal plants, in his own garden. And then he wrote this book, which became very famous, and it influenced the later works on medicine. His statue is there in Portugal. Now I come to the period of enslavement and colonialism. How when we were at the peak of our knowledge, there were a series of invasions which destroyed our supremacy in knowledge. The onslaught of Islamic invaders was followed by the European colonialism, which led to a massive destruction of our Indian systems of knowledge, which is actually has not been reversed even today. There has been some revival, but 75 years after our independence, there has still not been a proper decolonization. So there was a mindless violence unleashed on the famous universities of India from the 12th century onwards. You can see a picture here of Bakhtiyar Khilji, who is just who has attacked an ancient university, most likely Udantapura, but it could be also Nalanda. This picture might be showing Udantapura, but Nalanda was also destroyed by the invaders. And in this manner, all these universities, Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Jagaddala, Somapura, all those universities you saw in the eastern part of India were destroyed during this invasion. And this continued later, even it went to the south. Al-Biruni, who was a historian of the 11th century, he was in Mahmud Ghazni's team. And he himself said that Mahmud Ghaznavi's invasions caused Hindus to scatter like atoms of dust. And he wrote that the Hindu sciences receded to areas where our hands have not yet reached them, like Kashmir, Varanasi, and South India. And then in the coming centuries, even those peripheral areas came under the Islamic rule. There was a climate of oppression. And during the Sultanate period, there was a systematic stamping out of the Hindu learning and a destruction of manuscripts all over northern and central India. Destruction of temples and viharas, it became very common. Jizya was imposed. There was an emphasis on Islamic education. Delhi became a major center of Islamic learning. And that's how, the rich businessmen, the Rajas, only they kept the flame of learning alight for Hindus in the peripheral regions. During Akbar's rule, there was some respite for the Hindus, but again, that was reversed during Aurangzeb's time. The thing to note is that the Mughals, when they were ruling on India, even though at that time India was the richest country in the world, the Mughals did not build on the leading edge scientific concepts that were presented by Hindu scholars of an earlier era. So there was a chance to become world leaders in science and math during that period by connecting to the earlier knowledge, but that we missed the bus because of this the kind of rule that we had. So there was an absence of science education in that time because the Mughals were more interested in poetry than in science and technology. In fact, Irfan Habib has himself said, the Mughal Empire has not produced a single worthwhile text on crafts or agriculture. How many volumes of poetry or histories it might have to its credit? So this needs to be noted. The Sanskrit works of mathematicians and scientists of earlier times began to be forgotten. The madrasas proliferated and the students became adept in the finer detail of Quran and Hadith in Muslim India. Meanwhile, the Western world was making huge advances in science and technology based on the knowledge that had gone out from India during an earlier period. Now, when the Portuguese missionaries printed papers to Akbar, he was least interested in the potential of the printing press to transform education. So the same thing happened with Jahangir. And this is how we did not build up on our earlier knowledge. And following the heels of this Islamic rule came the British imperialism. Again, the British had spread their tentacles. Earlier, Europeans came to colonize India, but they were all driven away by the British and they held sway over India. Now they held sway over the fortunes of India. So initially, the British did not bother with educating the natives. They were playing politics among themselves. Even though they set up the two colleges, it was more to get a regular supply of qualified Hindu and Muslim law officers. So they wanted to administer India, and for that they set up two colleges who would produce a steady stream of helpers for them. And there was a big debate between the Anglicists and the Orientalists, who, when they started thinking of how should we educate India or not, there was a debate between these people. So eventually they decided that let's educate Indians in English, so that we get English people, English educated people to help us in governing India. Okay. So there was a convenience attached to having English speaking natives. This is the reason that the British imposed English on India. Large number of British officers could not understand the languages of India. So they wanted English speaking people, English speaking servants, you could say. And also the people in the army, they had a lot of the Indians working in the army. They could become disloyal if they learned in Persian or Sanskrit. That was the reason that English was imposed. And familiarly acquainted with English literature, the Indians would speak of great Englishmen with the same enthusiasm as the British themselves. This is all a part of a planned policy. The British, when they were communicating in letters to each other, they made this policy that if we educate the people in English, then they would value the English people, the English heroes. They would talk of Shakespeare, they would talk of the great English people, and they would not be so obsessed with their own gurus or their own heroes. So that is how the Macaulay's Minute, which is very famous, which came, and then after that, the English Education Act of 1835, it came after years of debate. And that's how English education was, English medium instruction was imposed on India. This is the famous Macaulay's Minute that many of you must have read, which says that we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Can I just see the time? It's okay. I have already taken 45 minutes. I hope it's not too late. So I want to highlight that when India was embroiled in the education debate, England itself was languishing in illiteracy. Most people had not gone to school, and the only book they had read was the Bible. So this was the condition of England when they were determining India's education. We come to know a lot about how India's indigenous education schooling was from the works of Dharampal, who wrote The Beautiful Tree. So Dharampal came across archives of great significance. The British themselves had conducted a survey of India to know what was the level of indigenous education. Before they imposed their own policy, they did a survey. And the results of those surveys are very interesting because they found that every village in India had a pathshala. There were 100,000 pathshalas in Bihar and Bengal alone. Reading, writing, epics, arithmetic were all taught. So you see, even though the higher education had been destroyed in India due to the invasions by the Muslims, the primary education was still not completely destroyed when the British came to rule over India. So they found a lot of schools all over India where they were still teaching reading, writing, epics, and all that. That had not been destroyed yet by the invasions. So this, when the British did all these surveys, then they made a plan how to change all this and how to make it all into English medium schools. And you will come to know how inferior it was. The later education was inferior compared to what existed earlier. Uh, and so there were very dedicated teachers who were teaching in those schools, and there were superior methods of teaching. There was high attendance in all those schools. There were not many dropouts. And in many of these schools, the Shudras were in majority while the Brahmins were in minority. This was found out during the surveys conducted by the British. So a lot of things that you hear today about the caste system is actually not based on fact. It is based on the colonial narrative that has been spread. So there were more Shudras and Brahmins. You'll find tables and all that. If you read Dharampal's book, which is based on the British surveys themselves, you will come to know a lot. This is Alexander Walker, who was working in the East India Company. And he said, no people probably appreciate more justly the importance of instruction than the Hindus. They sacrifice all the feelings of wealth, family, pride, and caste that their children may have the advantage of good education. This love of learning was no exclusive characteristic of the Brahmins, but this desire is strongly impressed on the minds of the Hindus. This was observed by Alexander Walker when he was appointed in India and traveling through India. And in those surveys, they noticed that there were many interesting innovations made by the Indians to teach the students. So for example, Reverend Andrew Bell, missionary, he was traveling through southern India, and he was very impressed with the way they were teaching. He found that the older students were teaching the younger students, even if there was no teacher present. And he took all these ideas and called it the Madras Method and introduced that in England. He noticed that outside many of the schools, there were heaps of sand on which the older students were teaching the younger students how to trace alphabets, how to do simple arithmetic problems, all those things. And Reverend Andrew Bell was amazed. He said, in our schools in England, we are complaining there is no blackboard, we don't have this, we don't have the infrastructure, and that's why illiteracy is there in England. But look at India, there is hardly any illiteracy because they are using such low-cost methods. So he packaged it as Madras Method and introduced it in England, Andrew Bell. So by 1821, 300,000 children were being educated under Dr. Bell's principles, and his ideas were adopted in Europe, West Indies, even Bogota in Colombia. Similarly, there are other innovative practices that were found. This is a picture of the Madras College in St. Andrews, which is in Scotland, which is standing even today, which was based on the Madras Method. Over a period of time, when the British ruled, when they exploited India, poverty and famine became very common. So all that good primary education system that existed, it all collapsed because there was rampant poverty. In some places, taxation was as high as 50% of the produce. And then on top of that, the food grains were being diverted to England. And that is the time when poverty began. Before that, we didn't hear of poverty in the sense that people didn't have enough to eat. And this is how even the primary education system collapsed in India, because India was being governed for the benefit of Britain. Everything that India produced, the food grains, the textiles, steel, gold, everything was for Britain. Nothing was for India. There was no food for teachers and students in the pathshalas. And in some places, there was poverty created overnight. The district collector, his role was to fleece the citizens, just collect and collect as much as you can. And I don't know why we still call them district collectors. Temples were not spared because whatever dana was being done by the people who went to temples, all that was being taken away as taxes by the British. And it is sad that even today this is continuing in southern India, especially, and people are trying to reverse that, but it is still not gone anywhere. The British educational policy sounded the death knell for regional languages. So once this English medium education was imposed, the Indian languages started suffering. The mother tongue was relegated to the second language, and illiteracy went up. Gandhiji said that in 1931, he said that the British had left India more illiterate than it was just 100 years before. Obviously, because there were schools in every village and and literacy was very high. But after English medium was imposed, then many people had problems with it, and they dropped out, and all those problems came. And they were poor, not just English language being imposed. They were all rendered so poor that illiteracy became very common. And when India became independent from the British, there was a fresh chance to decolonize. That did not happen. So we cannot keep blaming the British. After India became independent, there was a chance to decolonize and to improve the education system, but that did not happen to the extent that it should have. India's self gaze is still through alien eyes. We still look at ourselves from the foreigner's perspective because that's the way the education system has been institutionalized. All our textbooks are still from the foreign perspective. And our past heritage lies buried in regional and Sanskrit literature, but we don't know how to read. Most of us are not educated in Sanskrit, so we don't know how to read about our past heritage. So these are some of my closing thoughts. The contribution of India to the global body of knowledge is unparalleled. It is just simply unparalleled. Top class institutions, there were top notch scholars, there were master artisans, there was a whole ecosystem of learning. Mind you, it was not just a traditional education. We also had a system of teaching of skills, all the various skills that the craftsmen had. It was all being taught in a very institutionalized way. There is an enormous body of work that was generated in sciences, medicine, maths, other disciplines, and this knowledge went to other countries. So India provided the base on which the edifice of modern knowledge stands today. We should appreciate that. This is a famous quote of Michael Crichton that I love to share every time, that if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know that it is part of a tree. Okay. So here are some ideas that we can take from India's educational system. Maybe we can discuss that during the Q&A. Please look out for my second book, which will be probably published in July of this year. It will be titled Revisiting the Educational Heritage. Tentatively, it might be changed. It will be available in Hindi and English and other languages gradually. And it will expand on all the topics that were there in my first book, more details and more data. With this, I come to the end of my presentation. If you would like to ask me questions by mail, here is my email address. You can also find my first book on Amazon. You can find me on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and a little bit on Instagram. I'm not so active on Instagram, but I'm mainly on Facebook and Twitter. So thank you very much. Now I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a very, very enriching session.